The house was quiet in a way that most people would find unsettling. No television murmuring in the background, no partner's footsteps on the stairs, no children's voices calling from other rooms. Just Katharine Hepburn, alone in her Connecticut estate, exactly as she'd chosen to be for the past 36 years. When Spencer Tracy died in 1967, everyone expected Hepburn would eventually find someone else. She was only 60 years old, still vibrant, still working, still one of the most fascinating women in Hollywood. Surely loneliness would drive her back into relationship. Surely she wouldn't choose to live alone for the rest of her life. They were wrong. Katharine Hepburn lived alone from 1967 until her death in 2003, 36 years of solitary life, and she called it the best decision she ever made. This is the story of a woman who chose isolation and called it freedom, who lived alone for nearly 4 decades and never once regretted it, who proved that sometimes the person you need least is another person. Understanding Hepburn's choice requires understanding what came before. She'd been married once, briefly, in her 20s. Ludlow Ogden Smith, a Philadelphia socialite, married her in The marriage lasted 6 years on paper, but was effectively over within months. Hepburn hated being a wife, hated the expectations, the loss of independence, the way marriage tried to reshape her into something she wasn't. Then came Spencer Tracy, 26 years of loving a man she could never fully have, never publicly claim, never build a conventional life with. She'd lived in the shadows of his marriage, waiting for moments when he could be hers, organizing her entire existence around his availability. When Tracy died, Hepburn was finally free. Free from waiting, free from hiding, free from organizing her life around someone else's schedule, someone else's needs, someone else's constraints. And she discovered something remarkable. She liked being free more than she'd liked being in love. The decision to stay alone wasn't immediate. In the months after Tracy's death, friends tried to set her up. Eligible men, age-appropriate, successful, interested. Hepburn turned them all down. Not rudely, just firmly. She wasn't interested in dating. She wasn't interested in companionship. She was interested in living exactly as she pleased, and that meant living alone. Her family worried. Her friends worried. Living alone at 60 was one thing. But what about 70, 80, 90? Surely she'd need someone eventually. Someone to take care of her, to keep her company, to prevent the loneliness that supposedly destroys elderly people living solo. Hepburn's response was characteristically blunt. "I'm not lonely. I'm alone. There's a difference." And there was. Loneliness is involuntary isolation, a desperate desire for connection that remains unfulfilled. What Hepburn experienced was chosen solitude, a deliberate preference for her own company over anyone else's. She wasn't avoiding people because she couldn't connect. She was choosing solitude because she genuinely preferred it. Her daily routine reflected this choice. She woke early, usually around 5:30, made her own breakfast, usually fruit and toast, swam in Long Island Sound regardless of weather or temperature, spent hours reading, walking, tending her garden, cooked simple meals for herself, went to bed early. The routine varied little over decades. There was no one to negotiate with about dinner plans, no one to compromise with about temperature settings or television shows, no one whose mood she had to manage or whose needs she had to consider. Her time was entirely her own, structured exactly as she wanted, answerable to no one. Friends who visited were struck by how comfortable she seemed in her solitude. This wasn't a woman making do with isolation. This was someone who'd found her ideal living situation and was thriving in it. She was sharp, engaged, interested in the world. Nothing about her suggested loneliness or depression or the supposed deterioration that comes from aging alone. But society couldn't accept it. Journalists would ask about her personal life, always with an undertone of pity. "Don't you get lonely?" they'd inquire, as if loneliness was inevitable for someone living solo. Hepburn would stare at them like they were speaking nonsense. "Why would I be lonely? I have myself. I'm quite good company." This attitude was radical, especially for a woman of her generation. Women born in 1907 were raised to believe their value came from relationships, as daughters, wives, mothers. A woman alone was a woman failed, incomplete, to be pitied. The idea that a woman might prefer solitude, might find it superior to partnership, was nearly incomprehensible. Hepburn rejected this entirely. She'd tried partnership, she'd tried marriage, she'd tried love that required her to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating. And she'd found all of it inferior to the freedom of living alone. This wasn't settling for less. This was actively choosing what she discovered was more. Her house reflected her solitary life. It wasn't decorated for guests or designed to impress visitors. It was functional, comfortable, organized exactly to her preferences. Books everywhere, practical furniture, nothing ornamental or showy. the house of someone who lived for herself, not for others' approval. She employed minimal staff, a part-time housekeeper, a gardener occasionally, but mostly she did things herself, cooked her own meals, did her own laundry, maintained her own space. At an age when many wealthy people surrounded themselves with help, Hepburn insisted on self-sufficiency. Doing things herself wasn't burden, it was autonomy. The swimming was particularly important. Every single day, she'd walk down to the beach and swim in Long Island Sound. In summer, in winter, in storms, in calm, the water temperature didn't matter. This was her ritual, her meditation, her connection to something larger than herself. And she did it alone, always alone, because that's when she felt most herself. People would sometimes recognize her on the beach or in town. "Aren't you Katharine Hepburn?" She'd confirm it, chat briefly if she felt like it, then continue on her way. She wasn't hiding from the world. She just didn't need constant interaction with it. Brief encounters were sufficient. Extended company was unnecessary. Her work continued through her 70s and into her 80s. She made films, did television movies, stayed professionally active, but she'd go to set, do the work, and return to her solitary life. No socializing with cast and crew beyond what was necessary. No Hollywood parties or industry schmoozing. Work was work. Life was private, solitary, hers alone. Colleagues who worked with her during these years described an interesting dynamic. On set, she was professional, collaborative, present. Off set, she disappeared completely. Didn't join dinners, didn't attend wrap parties, went straight home to her solitude. Some found this rude. Others recognized it as self-knowledge. Hepburn knew what she needed, and it wasn't social performance. As she aged, the questions about living alone intensified. At 70, people thought it was eccentric. At 80, they thought it was dangerous. At 90, they were certain it was impossible. How could someone that old live without constant care, without someone monitoring them, without the safety net of a partner, or live in help? Hepburn managed just fine. She modified her routines as necessary, swimming in slightly warmer water, walking shorter distances, but she remained fiercely independent. When she needed medical care, she hired professionals. When she needed help with heavy tasks, she paid for services. What she didn't do was surrender her autonomy by inviting someone to live with her. Friends and family tried to convince her otherwise. Move to assisted living, they suggested. Or at least have a full-time nurse. Something to ensure she was safe, monitored, cared for. Hepburn refused every suggestion. She'd lived alone for decades. She was going to die alone, in her own home, on her own terms. This stubbornness bothered people, but it was entirely consistent with how she'd lived her entire life. Hepburn had always insisted on autonomy, always chosen independence over security, always preferred the risks of freedom to the safety of constraint. Why would that change just because she was old? The cultural resistance to her choice revealed something interesting about how society views aging. We accept that young people might prefer living alone. We even celebrate it as independence, self-sufficiency, strength. But elderly people living alone triggers anxiety. They're seen as vulnerable, at risk, in need of protection. The same choice that's admired in youth becomes worrying in age. Hepburn rejected this double standard entirely. Her need for independence didn't diminish with age. If anything, it intensified. The older she got, the less willing she became to compromise, to accommodate, to shape her life around anyone else's presence or preferences. She gave several interviews in her 80s and 90s where she discussed living alone. Her position was always clear. It was a choice, a preference, not a circumstance to be pitied. "I like my own company," she'd say. "I always have. Most people bore me. Solitude doesn't." This brutal honesty was vintage Hepburn. She didn't soften her opinions to make them more palatable. She didn't pretend to be lonely to satisfy society's expectations. She stated her truth plainly. She preferred being alone to being with almost anyone else, and she saw no reason to apologize for that. The honesty extended to how she discussed relationships generally. She wasn't against them for other people. She recognized that most humans needed partnership, craved companionship, thrived in connection. She just wasn't most humans. Her wiring was different. What others needed, she didn't. What others feared, she preferred. This self-knowledge is remarkable. Most people spend their lives trying to want what they're supposed to want, trying to enjoy what they're supposed to enjoy. Hepburn had the clarity and courage to recognize that her needs were different and the strength to honor those needs regardless of social pressure. The Tracy relationship became clearer in retrospect. For 26 years, everyone thought Hepburn was sacrificing, compromising, making do with a difficult situation. In hindsight, maybe the relationship's constraints were actually what made it tolerable for her. She got companionship and love without surrendering her autonomy. She had a partner without having to live with one. The very limitations that seemed tragic might have been what allowed the relationship to work for someone who fundamentally preferred solitude. After Tracy died, she could have replicated that structure with someone else, found another unavailable man, another relationship with built-in distance. But she didn't. She chose complete solitude instead. Which suggests that even the Tracy relationship, beloved as it was, still required more accommodation than she ultimately wanted to give. The house itself became a character in her later life. Journalists who visited described it as Spartan, functional, organized. Not cold, but not cozy either. The house of someone who lived practically, who valued utility over aesthetics, who didn't need environment to perform emotional labor. It was shelter, workspace, swimming headquarters, nothing more, nothing less. She had a small circle of people she tolerated, family members who visited occasionally, a few old friends, her assistant. But these were brief interactions, carefully controlled, ended when she decided they were over. She'd tell people when to leave. Not meanly, just directly. "I'm tired now, time for you to go." And they'd go, because that was the price of access to Katharine Hepburn. Her relationship with her nieces and nephews was particularly interesting. She loved them, in her way, but she loved them best at a distance, in controlled doses. They could visit, but not often and not for long. She'd ask about their lives, offer advice, then send them home. Connection without cohabitation. Family without the constant presence family usually demands. As she moved into her 90s, her body began failing in ways even her fierce will couldn't overcome. She developed tremors that had actually been present for decades, but worsened with age. Walking became difficult. The daily swims finally stopped, the first routine she'd surrendered in 70 years. But she still refused to leave her home or accept live-in care. She hired help as needed, nurses for a few hours, physical therapists, meal delivery when cooking became too difficult. She assembled a team of professionals who provided services without demanding intimacy, who helped without invading her space, who understood that their job was to enable her continued solitude, not to relieve it. This is the part of the story that's hardest for people to accept. The idea that someone would choose to age alone, to face physical decline alone, to approach death alone. It seems sad, seems wrong, seems like something that should be prevented. But Hepburn never saw it that way. She was aging exactly as she wanted to age, on her own terms, in her own space, with her autonomy intact, until the very end. The presence of other people wouldn't have made her decline easier. It would have made it harder, more complicated, less bearable. She died at home in 2003, at age 96, alone, as she'd lived. Reports say she simply went to sleep and didn't wake up. Family was notified after the fact. There was no deathbed scene, no final goodbyes, no dramatic last words. Just a woman who'd lived exactly as she chose, dying exactly as she chose, privately, quietly, on her own. The obituaries mentioned her decades of living alone, usually with a note of admiration mixed with disbelief. How had she done it? How had someone lived solo for 36 years without apparent loneliness or decline? What was the secret? There was no secret, just a woman who knew what she wanted and had the strength to choose it, regardless of social pressure. A woman who discovered that for her, the best relationship was the one she had with herself. A woman who proved that sometimes the happiest ending isn't finding the right person, it's finding yourself and being content with that. Katharine Hepburn lived alone for 36 years, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Not because she couldn't find companionship, but because she preferred solitude. Not because she was afraid of intimacy, but because she valued autonomy more. And she did it without apology, without explanation, without pretending to be anything other than exactly what she was, a woman who liked being alone. That's the radical truth at the heart of this story. Not that Hepburn survived living alone, but that she thrived in it. That solitude wasn't her compromise, or her burden, or her tragedy. It was her preference, her choice, her ideal life, and she lived it fully, completely, successfully, for nearly 4 decades, proving that sometimes the person you need least is another person.